It was supposed to be a simple job, just a few hours of sitting in a cold, empty storage facility, watching the cameras and making sure everything stayed locked up tight. The kind of job you'd take when you need money, but you don't expect to be doing much. But from the moment I stepped through those metal doors, I knew something was off. The place had an unsettling stillness to it, the kind of quiet that felt too thick, like the air itself was holding its breath. It wasn't until my first night shift that the truth began to unravel. The clock struck midnight, and I felt the temperature drop suddenly. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead flickered, then settled into an eerie buzz. I told myself it was just the usual creaks and groans of an old building, but then I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate. I checked the cameras, but no one was there. I thought maybe I was imagining things until I saw the first rule written on the office wall. Never go into the units after hours. That's when it hit me. There were rules here, rules I was meant to follow. But no one had bothered to explain them. Not the previous guards, not the staff. They were just there. And as the hours passed, I realized they weren't just guidelines. They were survival instructions, because breaking them could cost you everything. And as the night wore on, I began to understand why. I never thought much about what I'd do for work after I moved to the city. Fresh out of college, desperate for cash, I found the night guard position at Apex Storage Facility posted on a local job board. It sounded simple enough. 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., just monitor the security cameras, check the aisles once an hour, make sure everything was locked. Easy money for someone who didn't mind working alone. I wasn't worried about the hours or the loneliness. I had always been a night owl, and working alone didn't bother me. I liked the quiet, the stillness. But when I showed up for the first shift, I could already sense something was wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, a sort of pressing silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The kind of silence you can't quite place, but you feel it in your bones. The facility was tucked away on the outskirts of town, far from the bustling streets, surrounded by thick trees that blocked out most of the streetlights. The buildings themselves were old, faded by time, with metal walls that creaked and groaned as the wind howled through the cracks in the structure. From the outside, it looked like a typical storage facility, nothing special. But stepping inside felt different. The floors, worn from years of use, creaked with each step I took, as if the building was aware of my presence. The air inside was damp, heavy, and carried an almost metallic scent. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, flickering occasionally, casting strange shadows across the narrow aisles. I tried to push the uneasy feeling out of my mind, chalking it up to first-day nerves. Little did I know, that feeling would never go away. My first night shift started out like any other. I arrived around 10:45 p.m. to get settled in, taking a quick glance at the security desk and the outdated computer system. There was a stack of paperwork on the counter with the names and instructions for all the units, as well as a few forms to sign. After filling out the standard documentation, I checked the security monitors. Everything seemed normal: empty aisles, locked storage doors, and the cold, sterile glow of the fluorescent lights. The first few hours were slow and uneventful, the kind of night I had expected. I walked the halls every hour, checking the doors, making sure each unit was properly secured. The sound of my boots echoing down the long corridors seemed louder than usual, but I tried to ignore it. The building was old, after all. Everything creaked and groaned. At 2 a.m., I took my first break in the staff lounge, sipping a cup of stale coffee and scrolling mindlessly through my phone. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I chalked it up to nerves. Nothing unusual had happened. As I returned to the security desk, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible creaking sound coming from the back of the facility. I stopped mid-step, my heart skipping a beat. The hairs on my arms stood up. It sounded like a door opening, just a slight shift in the metal. But that was impossible. All the units had been locked. I checked the cameras, scanning the hallway for any signs of movement. There was nothing. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the building settling. I had to get back to work, so I grabbed my flashlight and made my way down the first aisle. The shadows seemed longer, stretching unnaturally as I passed each unit. The lights flickered above me again, briefly going out before coming back on. I stopped, staring at the bulb above, willing it to stay steady. A cold gust of air brushed against my face, making me shiver. I looked around. The facility was still and silent, but the unease I'd been feeling since I walked in was starting to grow. Then, I heard something else. A faint whispering, barely audible, like voices coming from inside one of the storage units. My pulse quickened. I froze, listening intently. It was hard to tell where the sound was coming from, but it definitely wasn't my imagination. I quickly turned on my flashlight and pointed it down the row of units. The whispering stopped, but I could feel the tension in the air, like someone, or something, was waiting just out of sight. I slowly stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering returned, louder this time, coming from Unit 73. I swallowed hard, staring at the door now half open. That was when I remembered the first rule I'd been told: never go into the units after hours. It was a simple enough rule, but the words stuck with me in that moment. I had been told it like a casual piece of advice, but now, standing in front of Unit 73, I realized how serious it was. Something was wrong. The whispering continued, and I could almost make out words now. It was like a voice, strained and almost pleading. I took a deep breath, backing away slowly, my mind racing. I couldn't explain it, but something inside the unit was alive, and I knew I couldn't ignore it. I had to leave. I turned and made my way back to the security desk, my steps quicker now, my hands shaking. That was the moment I understood. The rules weren't just there to keep the place organized. They were there for a reason. A very real reason. It wasn't long before I started to grow skeptical of the rules. At first, they seemed like harmless protocols, safety measures meant to keep the facility running smoothly. But the more I worked at Apex Storage, the more I began to question their necessity. Why shouldn't I enter the units after hours? What harm could there be in letting someone in after dark if they had a key? And why all the secrecy, all the hushed warnings from the other guards? It was as if no one wanted to talk about what was really happening in that place. I figured it was all just superstition, a way to keep the night shifts interesting for the older guards. The whispering from Unit 73 had stuck with me, but I tried to rationalize it. It had to be some sort of sound from the building settling, the pipes maybe. As for the door that had opened by itself, perhaps a malfunction, a gust of wind from the cracked window. I needed to see for myself, to prove that it was all in my head. So when the opportunity arose, I began to break the rules one by one. Rule number 1: never go into the units after hours. It happened on the 5th night of my shift. I had been walking the aisles, my mind wandering, when I passed by Unit 73 again. The faintest sound of whispering reached my ears. This time I couldn't ignore it. The words were clearer now. Help me, they seemed to say. Or maybe it was, let me out. Either way, the voice was unmistakable. A chill crept down my spine. I stood there staring at the door, the temptation to investigate gnawing at me. The rule was clear, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was inside. I grabbed the flashlight from my belt, my hands trembling as I shined it on the door. The latch was loose. Hesitating, I pushed it open, the metal screeching in protest. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature plummeted. My breath turned to mist in the air. The unit was empty. Nothing inside but rows of dusty shelves and cardboard boxes. But the whispers, they grew louder, surrounding me, crawling under my skin. The flashlight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. I turned in a circle, feeling the hairs on my neck stand on end. And then I saw it. A shape, barely discernible, at the far corner of the unit. A shadow, tall and elongated, its form shifting as though it were made of darkness itself. It was watching me. My pulse quickened, and I backed out of the unit, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing. It wasn't human. Rule number 2: always lock the office door before midnight. The office door had always been a precaution, something to keep anyone from wandering in or disturbing me during my shift. It seemed like such an obvious rule that I couldn't fathom why anyone would ever break it. But on this particular night, I didn't lock the door. I was too busy, tired, distracted by the images of the shadowy figure in Unit 73. My mind was spinning with possibilities, trying to make sense of the eerie events that had been unfolding around me. It wasn't until the clock struck 12:30 a.m. that I realized my mistake. The door was still wide open, and my eyes were locked on the monitors when I heard a sound. A soft knock, faint but unmistakable. It came from behind me, from the office door. My heart leaped into my throat. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was coming from inside my skull. I quickly turned around, but there was no one there. Just the door, slightly ajar, and the empty hallway beyond it. The whispers began again, low and guttural, this time not from the units, but from somewhere deeper within the facility. I could feel the presence in the hallway watching me. Frozen with fear, I rushed to lock the door, but before I could, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a moment. The air became thick, suffocating, as though the building itself was closing in on me. The knocking stopped, but the whispers lingered. It wasn't until I relocked the door that the air seemed to settle, though the tension never truly left. Rule number 3. If you hear whispering from inside the storage units, don't approach them. The whispers had never stopped after that night, but I had learned to ignore them, or at least convince myself that they weren't real. The longer I worked there, the more I tried to push them out of my mind. But that didn't last. One night, just past 2 a.m., the whispering came again. This time, louder than before. It was coming from Unit 56, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know what was inside. I had to prove that I wasn't just hearing things. I walked down the aisle toward the unit, my footsteps echoing in the cold silence of the facility. The whispering grew louder, almost urgent, like someone calling my name. As I reached for the door handle, I could feel the temperature drop, and the hairs on my arms prickled. I hesitated, but the voices were pulling me in, urging me to open it. I threw the door open, and immediately a cold gust of wind hit me, knocking the flashlight from my hand. The unit was empty, but the whispers didn't stop. They surrounded me, circling like a swarm of bees, their words now clear. You shouldn't have come. I turned to leave, but as I stepped backward, something shifted. The unit wasn't the same. The walls seemed to stretch, the shadows deepening. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding, but the whispers lingered in the back of my mind, echoing long after the facility had gone silent again. Rule number 4. If the lights flicker, don't walk through the aisles. I had already started to bend the rules, testing their boundaries. That night, the lights flickered again, just like they had before, only this time, they didn't stop. The buzzing, the flickering, the strange humming that filled the air. It felt like something was trying to break through. I could hear the sound of footsteps, but when I looked, no one was there. The lights dimmed again, and I could feel the air grow colder. I should have followed the rule. I should have turned around and left, but I didn't. I couldn't. I walked down the aisle, my feet dragging, as if the building itself was pulling me forward. The shadows seemed to move as I walked, stretching and twisting unnaturally in the dim light. The further I went, the more disoriented I became. I felt as if the aisles were closing in on me, the walls shifting, moving, rearranging. The footsteps were louder now, too loud to ignore. And then, just as I reached the end of the aisle, I saw it, a figure standing in the shadows. Its face was obscured, but the air around it seemed to vibrate as though it were alive, feeding off the darkness. I turned and ran, but the figure followed. I could hear its footsteps, hear its breath, growing closer with every turn I made. I rushed back to the office, locking the door behind me, my heart racing. I had broken the rule, and something had noticed. Rule number 5. Never let anyone in after dark, even if they have a key. By now, I was no longer rationalizing the rules. I was no longer telling myself that they were just quirks of an old building. I knew something was wrong, very wrong, and every time I broke one of the rules, something worse happened. One night, as I sat in the office, the buzzer at the front gate rang. I checked the cameras, nothing. I looked out the window, and there was a man standing at the gate. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, and he had a set of keys in his hand. He looked familiar. I couldn't place him, but his face seemed to match one of the workers I had seen during my shifts. I pressed the button and let him in. The moment the door opened, the temperature dropped. The man stepped inside without a word, walking past me without even acknowledging my presence. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. I felt something shift in the air, and I realized he shouldn't be here. I watched him disappear into the facility, but by the time I reached the hallway, he was gone. There was no trace of him, not even a footprint. The whispers began again, and this time, they were louder, more insistent. They weren't coming from the units anymore. They were coming from the walls, from the floor, from inside my head. The more I broke the rules, the more the facility seemed to come alive. It wasn't just the building anymore. It was something darker, something that was watching, waiting. The more I ignored the rules, the more it wanted to claim me, to pull me into its world of shadows and whispers. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I could stop anymore. Every broken rule felt like it was pushing me deeper into its grip. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The whispers, the strange occurrences, and the eerie feeling that had grown stronger with each passing shift. They all pointed to one thing. Something was wrong in that place, and I had crossed a line by breaking the rules. But it wasn't until I broke rule number 1, entering the units after hours, that the true consequences began to reveal themselves. Breaking rule number 1, entering the units after hours. It was just another night, or so I thought. The usual quietness of the facility settled in after the last of the tenants had left for the day. I made my rounds, checking each aisle, ensuring everything was locked and secure. But as I passed Unit 73 again, I couldn't shake the pull. The whispers had started again, louder this time, almost demanding my attention. I had ignored it before, convinced it was nothing more than the wind or the building settling. But tonight, I felt a desperate urge to investigate. The shadows in the hallway seemed to beckon me, coaxing me toward the door. I hesitated, my hand hovering just above the handle. The rule had been clear: never enter the units after hours. But I couldn't stop myself. I pushed the door open, feeling the cool rush of air hit my face. It was colder than I remembered, and as I stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop even further. My breath formed visible clouds in the air. I shined my flashlight around the unit, but there was nothing. The shelves were bare, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust. Yet the whispers, they were still there. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. I moved deeper into the unit, my heart pounding in my chest. And that's when I saw it. At the far corner of the room, hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I moved closer, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a person. It was something else entirely. A long dead body, its skin pale and stretched tight against the bones. Symbols, strange and jagged, were carved into its skin, glowing faintly in the darkness. I stepped back, my legs shaking. My mind screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Only the darkness, thick and suffocating. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran out of the unit, slamming the door shut behind me. My breath was ragged, my body trembling with fear. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew it was something alive, something that had been waiting for me. Breaking rule number 3, don't approach the whispering units. The whispers didn't stop after that. In fact, they grew louder, more insistent, as if they were following me. I tried to focus on my duties, but every time I passed by the units, I could hear them. Soft, unintelligible voices that seemed to crawl under my skin. I knew it was against the rules to approach them, but my curiosity overpowered my fear. One night I walked past Unit 56 and the whispering started again. It was coming from inside, just like before, but this time it felt different. The voices weren't distant. They were right there, just behind the door. I stopped in my tracks, my hand hovering over the handle. The whispers called to me, coaxing me closer. I should have turned around. I should have walked away. But I didn't. I opened the door. Inside, the shadows seemed to pulse and shift, stretching and writhing like living creatures. At first, there was nothing in the unit. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw them. Figures, humanoid in shape but twisted, contorted, and faceless. They were standing perfectly still, their limbs unnaturally long, their bodies hunched and gnarled. They didn't move, but I could feel their presence, their gaze fixated on me. My legs buckled beneath me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The whispers grew louder, now an incessant cacophony that filled my mind. The figures began to twitch, their arms and legs jerking as if coming to life, and then they moved. I slammed the door shut, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't process what had just happened. I stumbled back to the office, my hands shaking as I tried to steady myself. Breaking rule number 7. If a unit's door is open, leave the facility immediately. I knew I had broken the rules. I had seen things no one should ever see. But it didn't stop there. One night I arrived to find the facility different. The lights flickered as I walked through the entrance and the air was thick, heavy, as though the building itself was alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though no one was around. I walked to the security desk, but something caught my eye. A door, Unit 12, was wide open. I froze. I knew the rule. If a unit's door was open, I was supposed to leave immediately. No hesitation. But this time, something inside me wanted to see what was inside. I made my way toward the unit, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, the air grew colder. The door was half open, just enough to let me peer inside. But what I saw made my stomach turn. Inside the unit was nothing but darkness. At least that's what I thought at first. But then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It was tall, too tall, with a face that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like a shadow that couldn't hold its shape. Its eyes were wide and empty, and it reached out toward me with long, skeletal fingers. Before I could react, the door slammed shut. I stumbled back, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The air around me grew thick, suffocating. I could hear the whispers now, loud and frantic, surrounding me, suffocating me. The facility seemed to shift, the walls stretching and distorting. I turned to run, but the layout of the building had changed. The aisles no longer led to where they should. The doors were all locked, and the lights went out, plunging me into darkness. The next morning, I was the only one left. The other guards, the ones who had worked at the facility before me, had all disappeared. No one knew where they had gone. I checked the security logs, no unusual activity. It was like they had just vanished into thin air. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting with a life of their own. I started seeing things that weren't there. Figures standing at the edges of my vision, moving just out of sight. I'd hear footsteps behind me, only to turn around and find nothing. The building felt like it was closing in on me, shifting, changing, until I couldn't recognize it anymore. The walls seemed to bend. The aisles twisted into strange configurations, and the lights flickered endlessly. I couldn't escape. The facility had me. It was alive, and I was trapped. I tried to leave. I thought if I could just get to the front door, I could escape. But no matter how many times I walked toward it, the door was always locked. The facility was like a labyrinth, constantly shifting, reshaping itself to keep me inside. The whispers grew louder, their voices now unmistakable. They were in my head, speaking directly to me. You shouldn't have come. You broke the rules. I realized then that breaking the rules wasn't just a matter of protocol. It was a matter of survival. Every time I defied them, I invited something darker into this world. And now it was too late. The last time I tried to leave, I opened the door to the hallway, and it was no longer the same. The walls were covered in strange symbols, the floors slick with something wet and unidentifiable. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could feel it closing in on me. The whispers turned to screams, and the shadows reached out, grabbing at my legs. I ran, but I couldn't escape. I never could. By now, I had lost track of time. Days seemed to blur into one another, and the facility itself felt like it was stretching in all directions, an endless maze that I could never quite navigate. The whispers never stopped. They followed me, taunted me, and no matter how much I tried to ignore them, they always found a way to creep back into my mind. I had tried to escape several times, but each time the building shifted, the hallways twisted, and the exit doors remained locked. The facility had become a living thing, a monster that fed on my fear and trapped me inside its walls. I began to lose my grip on reality. The isolation, the constant terror, and the feeling that something was always watching me, it started to break me. My reflection in the mirrors no longer looked like me. My face had become hollow, gaunt, eyes wide with panic, always darting around, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. The darkness that seemed to grow inside the building was now seeping into my very soul. The strange occurrences escalated. At first I thought I was imagining things, but the longer I stayed, the more I realized that the facility wasn't just haunted. It was cursed, its very structure built on something ancient and malevolent. The rules, those deadly rules, were not just there for our safety. They were chains, keeping something at bay. But now, I had broken too many of them, and the consequences were too severe to undo. It was late into the night when I made my final attempt to leave. The whispers had reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices screaming in my head, telling me to run, telling me that I was already too late. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the walls around me pressing in, growing tighter with each step I took. I had made it to the front door again, the door I had seen 100 times before. But tonight, something was different. The air was thick with the smell of decay, like something was rotting just beneath the surface. The floor beneath me trembled as I reached for the door handle, but it didn't open. My hands were shaking violently as I pulled harder, but the door remained locked. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, and in the distance I could hear something else. A low growl, like an animal snarling, its breath hot against my skin. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. The growl was in my head. It was the building itself, angry, awake, and furious with me for breaking its rules. I turned back to the door. Something inside me, something primal, told me to get out, to leave at all costs. But the door wouldn't budge, and as I looked around I realized the truth. The building wasn't trying to keep me out. It was trying to keep me in. The walls shifted again. I felt the floor beneath me change, the ground beneath my feet warping as though the entire facility was alive. The building was alive, feeding off my fear, pulling me deeper into its darkness. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps, and I realized then that the doors, the windows, the walls, they weren't there to protect me. They were there to trap me, and I had been trapped for a long time. I don't know how long I wandered the halls after that. Time had stopped making sense. The lights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to move on their own. I could hear footsteps behind me, always just out of reach, like someone or something was following me, waiting for me to turn around. Every time I looked, there was nothing there, but I could feel it. I wasn't alone. The shadows began to take form. At first, they were just figures in the corner of my vision, flickering just beyond the reach of the light. But as I walked further into the facility, they became clearer, more distinct. They weren't human. They were twisted, their shapes grotesque and unnatural, and they watched me with eyes that weren't eyes at all. Just black voids, endless and empty. I froze in the middle of an aisle, unable to move, unable to breathe. The shadows surrounded me, their forms stretching toward me like long, bony fingers. I could hear their whispers, low, hissing voices, repeating the same words over and over. You shouldn't have stayed. And then one of them stepped forward. It was taller than the others, its body long and sinewy, its face shifting in and out of focus. One moment it was a man, its features twisted and warped. The next, it was a beast, its face full of snarling teeth. It stepped closer, and I could feel its cold, unnatural presence invade my space, like it was consuming the air around me. You broke the rules, it whispered, its voice like sandpaper scraping across my skin. Now you'll pay the price. Before I could react, it reached out, and I felt a cold, sharp pressure against my chest, like the air was being sucked out of me. I gasped, struggling to breathe, but it was no use. The shadows surrounded me, and the building itself seemed to close in, trapping me in its suffocating grip. It felt like hours before the darkness finally lifted. My vision was blurry, my mind a haze of fear and confusion. But when I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the hallway anymore. I wasn't in the facility. I was somewhere else. The walls were dark, but there was a faint light in the distance, just enough to see the faces staring at me. Faces I recognized. Faces of the guards who had worked here before me. But they weren't alive. They were like me. Trapped. Trapped in this place for eternity. Their eyes hollow, their expressions frozen in time. "It's too late," one of them whispered. "You're one of us now." I tried to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was no longer in control of my body. The building had claimed me, just like it had claimed the others. I was trapped, forever part of the facility, a soul bound to its walls, unable to leave. And now, I understand the true purpose of the rules. They were there to keep us safe, not from the building, but from ourselves. Because once you break them, once you open that door, there's no going back. The building feeds on your fear, on your curiosity, and once it has you, it never lets go. So, if you ever find yourself in a place like this, if you ever find yourself working alone in a storage facility, or in a place that just feels wrong, heed the rules. Don't break them. Don't go into the units after hours. Don't let anyone in after dark. Don't listen to the radio in the break room after 3 a.m. And whatever you do, never, never open a door that's already closed. Because once you break the rules, it's too late. The building will claim you, the shadows will come, and you will become one of them. You'll be trapped forever, just like the rest of us. It's too late for me now. I've crossed the point of no return, and I can feel the darkness inside me, pulling me deeper into the bowels of Apex Storage Facility. I used to think I had control over my life, over my actions, but I was wrong. The building owns me now, just as it owns all the others who have broken its rules. The walls close in tighter every day, the whispers never stop, and the shadows are always watching. If you ever find yourself standing in front of that facility, or one like it, if you're tempted to take that night guard job or ignore the warnings, remember what I've told you. Don't break the rules. They're not just guidelines, they're your only chance at survival. The next time you hear the whispers, when you see the door slightly ajar or the lights flickering above you, don't ignore it. Don't go into the units. Don't let anyone in. And most importantly, don't break the rules. Because if you do, you'll end up just like me. Trapped. Lost. A part of the building, forever bound by its darkness. And believe me, once you're part of it, you can never leave. So, take this warning to heart. The facility is always waiting, always watching. It knows who will break the rules, and it knows when it's time to claim them. Do not let it be you.